In the spring of 1943, a fisherman off the coast of Spain spotted something drifting in the water, a body in a military life jacket carried in by the tide. To everyone who found him, he was a tragedy of the war, an officer lost at sea, a briefcase still chained to his wrist. They could not have known that the dead man was the most successful secret agent of the entire conflict. They could not have known he had never drawn a breath in uniform. And they certainly could not have known that the papers in that chained briefcase were about to send the German army racing to defend a coastline the Allies had no intention of attacking. This is the story of one of the boldest deceptions in the history of warfare. A plan so strange, so macabre, and so audacious that if you wrote it as fiction, no one would believe it. It involved a corpse, a false identity built from nothing, a love letter, a chained briefcase, and a gamble with the lives of tens of thousands of soldiers riding on whether the enemy would believe a dead man. They called it Operation Mincemeat, and it worked beyond anyone's wildest hope. To understand why the Allies would attempt something so bizarre, you have to understand the problem they faced in 1943. The tide of the war was turning. The Allies had cleared North Africa and were poised to strike at the soft underbelly of Europe. And the obvious next target, the one every strategist on both sides could see on the map, was the island of Sicily. It sat there like a stepping stone between Africa and mainland Italy, the natural place to land. The problem was that it was so obvious. As one leader reportedly put it, anyone could see that the target was Sicily, and if the Allies could see it, so could the enemy, who would pack the island with defenders and turn the landing into a bloodbath. So the planners faced a riddle. How do you attack the obvious target without walking into the teeth of an enemy who knows you are coming? The answer was as elegant as it was ruthless. You convince the enemy that the obvious target is a trick. You make them believe that while you appear to be aiming at Sicily, your real blow is falling somewhere else entirely. You make the truth look like a lie. And to do that, the Allies needed to hand the enemy a set of secret documents so convincing that they would stake their defensive strategy on them. But you cannot simply hand the enemy your secrets. They would never trust a gift. Secrets have to be stolen, or discovered, or pried from the cold hands of a dead man who was never supposed to let them fall into enemy possession. And that is where the genius and the strangeness of the plan begins. The idea was to take a dead body, dress it as a military officer, give it secret documents pointing away from Sicily, and let it wash ashore in neutral territory where enemy agents were known to operate. The enemy would find the body, find the papers, and believe they had stumbled onto a priceless intelligence accident. The men behind the plan were officers of British intelligence, imaginative thinkers whose job was to outwit the enemy rather than outfight him. They knew that for the deception to work, every single detail had to be perfect. A dead body carrying secret papers is not enough. The enemy was not stupid. Their analysts would examine everything, question everything, look for the smallest crack in the story. So the British did not just create a body, they created a man. This is the part that still astonishes. They invented an entire human being. They gave him a name, a rank, an identity as a Royal Marines officer. They gave him a fiancée, complete with a photograph and tender love letters written in a feminine hand. They gave him a stern letter from a father, a receipt for an engagement ring, ticket stubs, a bill from his club, the small worn paper trail that every real life leaves behind. They filled his pockets with the debris of an ordinary existence, so that when the enemy searched him, they would not find a propaganda plant. They would find a person, a real, breathing, recently living man who had loved someone and owed money and carried his life in his pockets like everyone else. And here we should pause, because beneath the cleverness lies something solemn. The body they used had once been a real person, someone who had died and whose remains were pressed into this strange and secret service. The men who ran the operation understood the weight of that, and they treated the matter with a care that the secrecy of the time demanded. It is worth remembering, amid the ingenuity, that the centerpiece of this brilliant deception was a human being, and that the plan asked the living to handle the dead with both audacity and respect. The heart of the deception was in the briefcase, chained to the body as a courier would chain truly important documents. Inside were letters crafted to look like private correspondence between senior commanders. They were written with extraordinary subtlety. They did not announce the false target with a banner headline because that would have been suspicious. Instead, they mentioned it in passing, casually, the way real officers discussing real plans would refer to things both already knew. The letters implied that the true Allied targets were elsewhere, and that any move against Sicily was merely a feint, a diversion to draw attention away from the genuine assault. The most important lie was buried inside a mountain of mundane, believable detail. Then came the delivery and the agonizing wait. The body was transported in secret by submarine and released into the sea off the Spanish coast, positioned so the tide would carry it ashore in a place where the British knew enemy intelligence had eyes and ears. Spain was officially neutral, but it was crawling with German agents and sympathizers, and the British were counting on that. They were gambling that local authorities would recover the body, that the secret documents would be quietly photographed and passed up the chain to German intelligence, and that the enemy's own spies would do the work of carrying the lie home. And now the deception entered its most dangerous phase, because everything depended on what the enemy chose to believe. The British could plant the body, but they could not force the Germans to swallow the story. German intelligence was sophisticated and deeply suspicious. Their analysts pored over the documents, debated their authenticity, searched for signs of a trap. This was the knife edge of the entire operation. One skeptical officer, one detail that rang false, and the whole elaborate construction would collapse. And worse, the enemy would know the Allies were trying to deceive them and would brace even harder for the real attack. But the British had done their work too well. The personal effects, the love letters, the receipts, the perfect ordinariness of the invented man, all of it added up to a story too detailed and too human to be a forgery. Slowly, the enemy began to believe. The documents climbed the German chain of command, growing more credible at every step until they reached the very top. And then the lie achieved the impossible. It convinced the German high command, and reportedly the highest leadership itself, that the real Allied blow would fall away from Sicily and that the island was a diversion. The consequences were enormous. Acting on the false information, the Germans began shifting their attention and resources to defend the places the documents had pointed to. They moved forces, redirected their planning, and weakened the very island the Allies actually intended to storm. When the real invasion of Sicily came, the defenders were less prepared than they should have been, their attention pulled in the wrong direction by a dead man in a briefcase full of beautiful lies. Countless Allied soldiers who stormed those beaches faced an enemy that had been tricked into looking the other way. Lives were saved, in numbers no one can precisely count, by a deception that cost the enemy their certainty at the decisive moment. Now, here is where we should be careful and honest, as we always try to be. It is tempting to say that this single trick won the campaign single-handedly, that one body decided the fate of an island. The truth is more nuanced. Deceptions like this one worked alongside many other factors, and intelligence is always a tangle of competing signals. But by every serious account, Operation Mincemeat succeeded brilliantly at its actual job, which was to feed the enemy a false story and make them doubt the obvious. It reinforced exactly the misjudgment the Allies wanted. In the murky world of wartime deception, that is about as clean a victory as you will ever find. What makes this story endure is not just that it worked, but how perfectly it captures the strange logic of deception warfare. The Germans were not defeated here by a bigger gun or a stronger army. They were defeated by their own reasoning, turned against them. The British did not break into the German mind by force. They walked in through the front door, carrying a story the enemy was predisposed to find plausible, and they let the enemy's own intelligence and caution do the rest. The most sophisticated thing about the trick was that it made the victim feel clever. The Germans thought they had discovered a secret. In truth, they had been handed one. There is a profound lesson buried in that. The greatest deceptions do not feel like deceptions to their victims. They feel like discoveries. They feel like the enemy outsmarting you, intercepting your secrets, getting lucky. A clumsy lie shouts its message, and invites suspicion. A masterful one whispers, lets itself be found, and allows the target to talk himself into believing it. Operation Mincemeat worked precisely because it never tried to convince the Germans of anything. It simply created a situation in which the Germans would convince themselves. Think, too, about the sheer nerve required to attempt it. The planners were betting the success of a major campaign and the lives of the men who would lead it on a chain of fragile assumptions. That the body would wash ashore in the right place, that the right people would find it, that the documents would be examined, and not simply buried with the corpse, that enemy analysts would believe rather than doubt, that the information would climb all the way to the top. Any link in that chain could have snapped. It took extraordinary imagination to conceive the plan and extraordinary courage to stake so much on it. These were people willing to gamble everything on understanding how the enemy thought. And that, in the end, is the real weapon in this story. Not the body, not the briefcase, not the forged letters. The real weapon was a deep and patient understanding of human psychology, of how people assess evidence, of how suspicion can be lulled and belief can be coaxed. The British won this round of the war not by knowing more about tanks or guns, but by knowing more about the enemy's mind than the enemy knew about theirs. They understood that a careful man, shown the right evidence in the right way, will build his own prison of false belief and lock himself inside it. By the time the war ended, Operation Mincemeat had earned its place among the most celebrated intelligence operations ever conducted. It became a model of what creative, audacious deception could achieve, studied and admired long after the guns fell silent. And it stands as a permanent reminder that warfare is fought not only on the battlefield, but in the shadows, in the mind, in the quiet space where a single planted idea can move armies. A handful of imaginative officers, a borrowed identity, and a story too human to doubt accomplished what whole divisions could not. They made the enemy defend the wrong coast. So the next time you imagine the great turning points of the Second World War, do not picture only the beaches and the bombers. Picture a body drifting in the sea off Spain, a briefcase chained to a lifeless wrist, and a story so carefully constructed that it fooled the most powerful men in the enemy's command. Remember that the most devastating thing you can hand an enemy is not a weapon, but a lie he is eager to believe. And remember the strange, brilliant, slightly haunting truth at the center of it all. Sometimes the most powerful soldier in a war is one who was never alive to fight in it.